This is a good fight. It's one that I'm looking forward to. It'd be great to see Paul Smith do it. I don't think he's going to. I've picked Abraham in this fight. I'm not sure whether I'm thinking by KO or by points. I'll touch on that in a bit more detail in a moment, but I'm a fan of Paul Smith. He's someone who's been on my radar since The Contender, which I used to be a massive fan of as a kid. And I'd love it if he could go and get a belt. You know, perhaps the most unlikely of champions, someone who has always been viewed as kind of a British, European level fighter. He's got his opportunity, once in a lifetime opportunity. We'll see whether he can grab it with both hands and take it. Arthur Abraham, I think, is going to have too much on the night. Fighting at home, home crowd, home judges, home promoters. It's going to be a real uphill battle for Smith, this. I do think Arthur Abraham has shown signs of slipping here. I don't think he's quite the boxer he was. I don't think he's quite the super middleweight. I don't think he's the same fighter at super middleweight that he was at middleweight. But the facts, and I also don't think he's the same puncher he was at middleweight. I don't think he's carried that up to super. But let's look at the fighters who've beaten him. Robert Stieglitz, Andre Ward, Carl Froch, Andre Dirrell. Those are the four names who've beaten him. Only Stieglitz won by stoppage. Now, for those who don't remember that fight, it wasn't exactly like getting spark knockout. It was basically an eye injury that caused the TKO, caused them to stop the fight. Stieglitz, Abraham's eye exploded. It was a horrific injury and they had to call the fight off for his longevity. But he came back in a rubber match and he won. He beat Stieglitz, and everyone thought Abraham's career was over. But Stieglitz, who's a decent level fighter, he came back and he won. Or he's won 2 fights on the judges' scorecards with Stieglitz. So, would you see Paul Smith beating Stieglitz? Probably not. Abraham's beaten Stieglitz as recently as 6 months ago. It's a real tough ask for Paul Smith. Don't get me wrong, I think he's a live underdog. I think my opinion is that this fight depends on how much of Abraham is left, as opposed to how good is Paul Smith going to be, because we've seen Paul Smith step up before. We've seen what happens when he fought De Gale. We've seen what happens when he fought Groves. As a side note, what would have been the odds when, De Gale handled him, that Paul Smith would be fighting for a world title before De Gale? I bet those odds would have been very, very low, and I bet that will be a source of upset to James De Gale. But I think Paul Smith is a good British level fighter. If he's fighting against the likes of Tony Dodson, Tony Quigley, maybe he's just a little bit a level above. If he was fighting against the likes of Groves, De Gale, maybe even Rocky Fielding, he's starting to struggle slightly. He's not someone I view as an elite level fighter or an elite level knockout artist. He's been stopped twice by Groves and De Gale, and it's no coincidence those stoppages have come as he stepped up in class. If we look at his preparation for this fight, one fight in 2012 against an opponent who had 4 wins, 12 losses. 2 fights in 2013 against Tony Dodson and an opponent with 10 wins, 52 losses. And in 2014, 1 fight against an opponent at 7 wins, with 7 wins, 3 losses. As a side note, Smith weighed in at 171 pounds for his last fight and 183 pounds, so well over the light heavyweight limit, into a sort of mid-sized cruiserweight in his last fight in 2013. It's not ideal preparation for a world title shot. Fighting opponents when you're £15 above your weight limit of your division, when those opponents have huge losing records, it isn't ideal preparation to beat an Arthur Abraham. And when you look at the guys who have beaten Abraham, Dirrell, Stieglitz, Frotz, Ward, and you compare those records to what I've just mentioned with Paul Smith, it doesn't stack up. Now I know Abraham's slipping, but Paul Smith isn't exactly a huge puncher for the division. And whilst Abraham has shown signs of slipping, this is a guy who outpointed Stieglitz over 12 a few months back, compared to Paul Smith, who fought a guy who had 10 wins, 52 losses 9 months ago. I'd like Paul Smith to do it. I'm a fan of his. I think it's going to be too big a ask. I think going to Germany on a different promoter's bill in front of the massive German crowds, it's going to be very hard for Smith to win on points. He's going to really have to dominate this fight to win on points, or knock Abraham out. Abraham's only been knocked out once by Stieglitz, and as I say, that was more due to an injury than a sort of clean knockout. So Abraham's a hardy, tough fighter. Smith isn't the biggest puncher. Knockout seems unrealistic here. To win this fight, Smith is going to have to dominate and win by a clear points decision in order to get the verdict. As much as I'd like Smith to do it, as much as I'll be watching the fight, hoping and praying he wins, realistically I don't see it. My pick for this fight is Abraham. The question is, will it be stoppage? Will it be points? I'm inclined to lean towards Abraham by stoppage, so I don't think Smith's had adequate preparation in terms of his last couple of fights. And I think when Smith has been stepped up in level of opposition, the Gale, Groves, he's been stopped. Now, you could argue De Gale and Groves represent a higher level of opposition than Abraham, perhaps. However, this is a slightly younger De Gale, a slightly younger Groves, and I think there's parallels with the standard of Abraham now. So I'm leaning towards the stoppage. I'm confident on Abraham to win. It's a good fight though. I'm looking forward to seeing it. And it's a great job from Eddie Hearn getting a fighter like Paul Smith, who's been viewed as a British level fighter, to this point. In terms of what Smith brings to the party, he's solid but unspectacular. Not the best defensively, not the best mover, not electric hand speed, not electric power. He's kind of 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10 in every category. And it's because of that lack of world-class preparation, because of that lack of world-class ability, I think he's going to struggle. And I don't think Abraham has faded enough to mean that a passionate fighter with grit and determination is going to have enough to pull out the upset. I'd like it, but I don't think it's going to happen. I'm keen to hear people's thoughts. Do people think Paul's got a chance? How do you see the fight going?